Haida has a unique forestry history, from traditional forestry activities that the Haidas have engaged in for millennia to the commercial forestry.
Tonight, after a logging dispute, an agreement is reached on Haida Gwaii.
So we made a bunch for our employees and for the elders of the community.
And a dry cleaning business in Alberta shifts to mask making during the pandemic. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Melissa Bridgen. With 1/3 of inmates in federal prisons being Indigenous, Correctional Services Canada continues to come under fire for its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Jamie Pasha-Gumscom reports.
Last week, an Indigenous inmate in Quebec filed a lawsuit against Correctional Services Canada. Now, there's a lawsuit out of Ontario. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association is asking the federal court to order CSC to stop violating prisoners' rights. Director Abby Desmond says Public Safety Minister Bill Blair's recent statement that inmates are being released is misleading.
In any given month, CSC releases a few hundred people. That's not an increase over what would be considered normal business for CSC, and I don't think normal business is sufficient to respond to this unprecedented health crisis. What we would be looking for is really an indication that CSC has taken more steps than it would in the normal course of its work to triage the population and make sure that people are safely housed.
Desmond says Indigenous prisoners are at particular risk because they make up a large portion of federal inmates. This is also a concern to Jesse Donovan, a lawyer with Indigenous rights law firm First Peoples Law. He is also calling for the release of prisoners.
So what Canada needs to do is cooperate with Indigenous governments in order to determine how these targeted releases of prisoners should go forward. One of the most important parts is that Indigenous peoples are actively involved in the process so that the release of prisoners can take place in a planned and safe manner.
Despite assurances that Canada is doing all they can to protect inmates, prisoners continue to get sick. CSC now reports 343 positive cases and 2 deaths so far. Dr. Theresa Tam, Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, said while social distancing is an issue in prisons, releasing prisoners must be closely monitored.
Supporting people as they be released from institutions, knowing what their plan is for infection prevention control. If there are local requirements for isolation or quarantine for 14 days, for example, if that's in play, they need to be supported in order to do that, to protect themselves but also their community. So those kind of plans are really important.
Tam says should cases come up in any more federal prisons, rapid testing and a good supply of personal protection equipment will be essential. APTN reached out to Correctional Services Canada but did not receive a response by deadline. Jamie Pasha-Gumscom, APTN National News, Ottawa.
When it comes to COVID-19, the Mohawk community of Kanesatake, Quebec has totally a clean bill of health. No cases reported. But as the province gradually reopens, Kanesatake's call to keep up checkpoints isn't sitting well with its neighbors. Lindsay Richardson reports.
It's not the first time Kanesatake Mohawks set up checkpoints on the community's main thoroughfare. But unlike Wet'suwet'en Solidarity or other protests, this time it's not political.
This has nothing to do with any land claims or anything political. This is simply health-based. We're trying to save lives.
There are 0 cases of COVID-19 in Kanesatake, even though the virus is encroaching on nearby towns. Grand Chief Serge Simon says reinforced borders are keeping the population safe.
It's almost like we're an island, and all around us you'll see little red dots of all the infections of the surrounding area. It's like there's a sea of it surrounding us.
But with tourist season approaching and the province looking to reopen, Oka Mayor Pascal Quevillon asked the emergency response unit to stand down and defer to provincial police. Simon says the SQ won't exert proper controls. Kanesatake has turned away thousands of cars since the pandemic began.
Despite that, he still went ahead and he threatened our checkpoint or dissuasion points with arrest.
On Monday, Council was served a cease and desist notice signed by Quevillon threatening legal action. According to the document, the inconvenience and detours for Oka residents are, quote, unacceptable and intolerable, but the response unit won't budge.
Bonjour, Auquois, Auquois.
So Quevillon took to Facebook Wednesday saying the checkpoints created tax-free jobs for Kanesatake. And the only explanation for no cases, he says, is that 0 tests were done.
De dire que leur façon de faire fonctionne parce qu'ils ont 0 cas sur leur territoire, c'est totalement faux. Ça n'est pas réel, malheureusement.
Simon says no one was tested because no one developed symptoms. But protecting elders and language keepers remains the priority.
We've had a history of surviving this. So we're not going to let some government tell us when it's time for us to live and die.
Having already survived cholera, smallpox, and tuberculosis outbreaks, the Grand Chief says Kanesatake is willing to persist despite the order until there's a COVID-19 vaccine. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Kanesatake, Mohawk Territory.
The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples is taking Indigenous Services Canada to court over what they say is inadequate and discriminatory funding for its membership. CAP says it represents 90,000 non-status and off-reserve Indigenous people. It's asking for a judicial review of the $250,000 that Indigenous Services gave the organization to support its members during the COVID-19 pandemic. Robert Bertrand is CAP's national chief. He addressed the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs today.
This was the result of a competitive bureaucratic process that pitted off-reserve organizations against each other. This means about $25,000 per PTO, or less than $3 per capita for those in need in our communities across the country. $15 per capita is not enough for effective support programs for the most marginalized groups in Canada. I don't need to reiterate the poverty, chronic health issues, over-policing, and discrimination faced by our Indigenous people.
The Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations has released a terse statement after Health Canada asked the RCMP to break up a Sundance. About 20 people were participating in the ceremony on Beardy's and Okamasis First Nations northwest of Saskatoon last weekend. The leader of the ceremony says strict safety protocols were followed and the elected band council were in full support. A statement by FSIN Chief Bobby Cameron says, quote, "We will practice our traditional First Nations ceremonies as we see fit." Cameron says we don't need anyone telling us and we won't be allowed to conduct these ceremonies. Well, an agreement has been reached over protected trees harvested and used for cultural purposes in Haida. We've got details after the break. First, here's a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. To the east coast, we've got 6 and cloud in St. John's, sunshine and 15 degrees for Fredericton. Happy Valley, Goose Bay, 2 and snow. Same with Nain, Kuujjuaq -1. Val-d'Or, 10 and rain. Montreal, sunshine and 13 degrees. Ottawa, 14 and sunny skies. North Bay, sunshine and 12. Sioux Lookout, cloudy and 12 degrees. 11 and cloud for Big Trout Lake. Churchill, -2 with a mix of sun and cloud. God's Lake and Thompson and Norway House, sunshine and 14. 9s for Gimli and Winnipeg and cloudy skies. 15 and cloud for Brandon. Swift Current, rain and 13 degrees, 13 in Saskatoon with a mix of sun and cloud. 6 for Buffalo Narrows, cloudy skies, -1 with a mix of sun and clouds in Stony Rapids. Welcome back. Indigenous Services Canada said on Saturday its data does not accurately reflect how hard COVID-19 is hitting Métis communities, First Nations people off reserve, and urban Inuit. APTN's web reporter Brett Forrester is chasing this story, and he spoke with Dennis Ward yesterday.
Brett, thanks for joining us. Why does Indigenous Services say their data does not accurately represent how hard COVID-19 is hitting these communities?
Well, what the Minister of Indigenous Services, Mark Miller, said on Saturday was that they essentially aren't getting disaggregated data from the provinces and territories. So what it kind of ends up in is a sort of what MNC spokesperson David Chartrand called the jurisdictional limbo, or a jurisdictional dark zone, where ISC is reporting the positive cases that are within their jurisdiction, which is on reserves, but they're really not tracking and they're not reporting the number of cases that are confirmed in Métis communities. They're not tracking the number of cases that are confirmed off reserve. And so what you're getting is kind of a jurisdictional issue where they essentially admitted on Saturday that they just don't have a statistically accurate portrait of how hard COVID-19 is hitting Indigenous people writ large.
So just how wide is it believed the discrepancy between what Indigenous Services reports and what the reality is?
Yeah, so a Yellowhead Institute report was just released today. They've been doing their own research into the number of cases that are in Indigenous communities, both on reserve and off reserve. And the number they are counting is over 450. That's 465 cases of COVID-19. And APTN News has conducted its own analysis of data that's being reported by communities and by local leaders across the country. And our number is getting pretty close to theirs. So we're not tracking off-reserve data, but compare this to what Indigenous Services Canada is reporting. As of yesterday, they were reporting 183 confirmed cases of COVID-19. And what you're seeing again is this kind of jurisdictional disputation or squabbling where Indigenous Services Canada isn't reporting the numbers that are confirmed in La Loche, for example. Now, La Loche is a municipality, but according to the 2016 census, the population was 98% Indigenous. It was, 80% or something First Nations, and the rest was Métis. So I think that qualifies as an Indigenous community. But because it's a municipality, they're saying it's under provincial jurisdiction, and so ISC isn't reporting that data as, as an Indigenous community that's being affected.
So does the government have some plans to start bridging the gap there?
Yeah, as the minister mentioned on Saturday, they've announced $250,000 to go towards projects that are trying to fill in this gap. One initiative they mentioned was the work of Dr. Janet Smiley. She's a Métis family physician who is working at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, and she's been working on this for the last decade or so. And her initiative is what she calls a strategic alliance. She's working with First Nations, Inuit, Métis organizations, regional health services providers, and she is trying to work on what she calls a system to rapidly track COVID-19 cases as they're reported, not just in communities, but within urban centers as well.
What are you hearing from community leaders about all this?
Well, I reached out to Dr. Smiley, and the interesting thing she said is that she was not prepared to be mentioned on national television. So she actually didn't know that this funding was coming. She says she hasn't actually heard anything from the federal government. She hasn't got any of that money. And again, so she's been working on this well before this announcement, and she's been working on it for many years. So she said it's positive. This is something that probably should have started a long time ago, but she's happy that they're seeing some movement. And I also talked to Dr. Veronica McKinney. She heads up the Northern Medical Services unit at University of Saskatchewan, which is a tripartite organization which works with the provinces, the feds, local health services providers. And she actually said it was quite frustrating listening to that announcement, because she says it's not that there's a data gap. That data is there. As I said earlier, the population is about 98% Indigenous in La Loche, according to the census. So that data is there. It's just that for whatever reason, it's not being reported. It's not being transmitted to the federal government. And so she thinks that they need to be really taking action right now. So it's always good to do research, but it's important to take action. And finally, I talked to Natano Bed. He's the president of ITK, Inuit Taprit Kanatami, and he essentially said that in the short term, he wants both provinces and territories to begin to report and use those ethnic identifiers, because what he said is that they are in the dark. They really don't have a solid idea of just how many Inuit have tested positive for COVID-19 outside of Inuit Yungat, the traditional homeland of the Inuit in Canada. So he's really hoping that the provinces and territories really start to use this tool that they have at their disposal.
Very important time for accurate data. Brett, appreciate you taking some time for us.
Thank you, Dennis.
Following protests last year against logging in an effort to protect trees used for cultural purposes in Haida, the Haida Nation and the province of British Columbia have reached a logging agreement on the island. Lee Wilson reports.
Last October's logging protests in Haida were centered around concerns over clear-cutting of cedar trees, particularly ones deemed important for cultural use. But now a solution has been found. The Haida Management Council, with representation from the province and Haida Nation, has decided to slightly reduce the annual allowable cut on the island's timber harvesting.
Haida has a unique forestry history from traditional forestry activities that the Haidas have engaged in for millennia to the commercial forestry industry that makes up a large part of the island's economy today. But in the recent years, it hasn't been that great, because of the downturn.
The fight to protect the cedar was boosted by a BC Supreme Court affidavit filed by Robert Davidson, the acclaimed Haida carver, responsible for carving the first totem pole on the island in 100 years in 1969.
I didn't realize how important that was to our culture because I was not exposed to the history.
Davidson's passion for his culture has sparked a passion in others. Cedar is used for totem poles, canoes, and longhouses. The bark for weaving. Haida carvers and artists have emerged in recent years, and logging has continued. But with BC forestry in an economic downturn, and cedar is the most profitable wood, conflict has emerged. Davidson hears a reduction to cutting, but wonders how many trees will be left when cedars take hundreds of years to grow.
How we create a sustainable industry. I know we can't stop logging. It's part of our life. I live in a wooden house and I use wood. We need to walk the fine line together.
Haida Management Council is attempting to strike a balance. Crosby says technology has improved, and they are taking extra steps to protect cedar and forest ecosystems.
Those guys didn't have this information. What we were like what I talked about, like the mapping and the vegetation resource inventory. They didn't have that. They didn't have LiDAR. They didn't have that. So now it's better than it was before.
Lee Wilson, APTN National News, Haida.
Time for another break, but coming up, highlights from today's In Focus, where we talked about how you can get food surpluses to communities in need, and we caught up with an educator and medicine man from the Navajo Nation, which has been hard hit by COVID-19. First, though, here's the rest of tomorrow's weather forecast for the west and the north. To northern Alberta, we've got sunshine and 6 degrees for high level, 6 and snow for Fort McMurray. 12 and sunny in Edmonton, 20 and sunshine for Lethbridge. Vancouver, rain and 16 degrees, same with Bella Coola, 18 and sunny in Quesnel. 7 and snow for Fort Nelson. Prince Rupert's going to be 15 with a mix of sun and clouds. Beaver Creek, 10 and rain. Old Crow, snow and 2 degrees. Mix of sun and cloud for Norman Wells, 2 degrees. Wauti, -3 and snow. Fort McPherson, 1 and snow. Colville Lake, -2 and snowing. Cambridge Bay, -1 and snow. Arviat, snowing and -5. Tallyoak, 1 degree and snow. Igloolik, -4 and snow. Clyde River, snow and 0. Welcome back. We covered a lot of topics on today's In Focus, but let's take a look at some of the highlights from the Regional Food Distribution Association in Thunder Bay about how you can get surplus food to communities in need. And the Navajo Nation, we have highlights too from them. They're dealing with the worst outbreak in America per capita. Here's some of the show's highlights.
Well, we're going to be looking at having conversations with some of the communities. Some of them need to have a recovery plan because, quite frankly, moving forward, so whether that be food banks or gardening or buying groups, there are a lot of options that have been discussed many times. We're a charity. We don't have the resources, but we certainly do have the ear and the eye of the National Provincial Association where we can step in and help. And we can tap into expertise that will help them with their food sovereignty plans, buying groups, because quite frankly, after we develop the relationships, there's the infrastructure, there's training. Every community has to have a champion, so that's our biggest challenge.
What's been the federal government's response to the crisis there?
As far as I know, they have made overtures to the Net College in order to provide funding and increased healthcare coverage. Sometimes that makes it through. Sometimes there's bureaucratic issues that get in the way of it. And so a lot of it has come from grassroots organizations, mutual aid. It's an expression of a term that we utilize in Navajo Nation called ke, which is based on kinship. And so we're just taking care of one another because we all are related. We're all five-finger Earth surface people. Mm-hmm. And so we're making sure that, you know, the people that need these masks, they have them, and some of them were 3D printed, some of them were sewn up, mailed out, what have you. So that's really been the way that we've utilized our relationship to make sure that everybody is healthy and well-fed and they have water, things like that.
For 40 years, the Good Fish Lake First Nation in Alberta has been operating one of the largest laundry and dry cleaning businesses in Canada. Now they've added something new, COVID masks, and they're a big seller. Chris Stewart has more.
Tom Jackson is the CEO of the Good Fish Lake Business Corporation. Since 1978, the band-owned business has been offering laundry and dry cleaning to the oil sands sector, and business is very good. A fleet of trucks drive daily to Fort McMurray, picking up and dropping off garments for oil giants Syncrude and Suncor. In 1989, they started producing industrial coveralls for oil workers. With COVID, they began to make protective masks.
So we made a bunch for our employees and for the elders of the community, and then made some more for the community as well. And from that, we kind of learned how quickly we could make them, all that type of thing. And we wound up with some fairly major orders for over 100,000 masks from the energy industry.
And retail stores began making orders.
And so we've had to add people and production capacity in the last little while to keep up with the mask orders, which is a very nice problem to have, considering everything that's going on with this pandemic and how it's affecting businesses.
Natalie Jackson is one of the seamstresses who was making coveralls, but now makes the masks. She says she can make 300 per day.
It truly is an honor to be helping not only our community, but other communities, and also the industries out there that we normally deal with, Syncrude and Suncor. A true honor.
Natalie says even with the facility making 10,000 masks per week, they are still following safety protocols.
We stay safe and we follow procedure. We practice procedure every day. We are reminded. And so we practice at home when we wear our masks, our protective equipment, everything necessary we need to stay safe throughout the day.
They are still looking to hire more temporary workers until their masks are no longer needed. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
Amazing work, Good Fish Lake. Well, that is your news for this Wednesday. If you missed today's In Focus, you can visit APTN News' Facebook page. You can watch the whole show on our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a good night.